what's been the biggest change in aesthetic medicine are the injectables, and we touched on that. The injectables, for instance, the most popular and the first well-known, widely used injectables was Botox.
I don't think I know anyone that doesn't do Botox.
And so when I was a fellow, my thesis was in botulinum toxin.
Really?
They thought I was an alien. They said there is no way
to use as a wrinkle remover.
Well, we didn't know about wrinkle removal at the time. I was a fellow in 19.
When did Botox first start being used for that?
1992, and my fellowship was in 1987, 1988.
Oh, interesting.
And when I did my presentation at the University of Illinois on botulinum toxin and all the applications that I thought it could be used for, cosmetic wasn't even thought of.
Really?
Even though many of us, including my dear friends who were the discoverers, Alistair and Jean Carruthers in Vancouver, Canada, they wrote the first article about somebody who was being treated for spasm, and they noted that their frown lines looked better.
Oh,
so that's how it all got started.
Oh my gosh.
And so we were using it for spastic disorders and eyelid spastic disorders, and one of the pioneer of botulinum toxin was a pediatric ophthalmologist named Alan Scott, who owned the patents and was using it for crossed eyes in children because he can align the muscles with weakening muscles. So his fellow happened to be Jean Carruthers, who was the one who eventually wrote the first article for cosmetic use. And he wound up selling his patents to Allergan. They didn't even know what to do with it because they were an eye company.
They weren't using it for...
No, they were using it just for spasm and thought they overpaid for it, which was pennies.
Wow.
And now it's $1 billion drug. So, so that was my thesis. People thought I was crazy. We started writing about it. Jean and Alistair wrote the first cosmetic article about frown lines looking better after Botox. And it's been the most challenged drug in our time because there are actually hate groups that talk about people shouldn't be using that.
Yeah, I get a lot of that.
And which is interestingly, but every time they try to demonize the drug or investigate some of the concerns that they have with the drug, they never find any real concerns. There's been a couple of articles in the past few years that are really nonsense. They talk about things that just don't happen in humans in small animal models. It's almost like the saccharin.
When it first came out, there was a thing that it was a poison and
right.
all
And
that.
Well, the biggest problem they had is they called it a toxin.
Right.
And by using toxin, that by itself, you think it's something bad.
And weren't people getting it from alternate sources?
Well,
I remember reading about people that had really bad...
There was one of the things about Allergan, and I know Allergan very well because I chair the medical advisory board for the company for several years. They are really big into R&D and really investigate the safety and efficacy. When you apply for FDA approval, what the FDA looks at is the drug safe and does it work? And this drug has been so vetted, but there are some off-brand botulinum toxins, and there was some veterinarian used. It was specifically said on the bottle, not for human use. And the person in Fort Lauderdale got into trouble using it on his friends. So it's just crazy. But it's now got hundreds of uses, and the interesting ones are the ones in the future. So it's now one of the biggest drugs used for migraine. We know that. So it's a very effective in migraine headache. What's one of the most exciting things is it's going through the FDA trials, which I was a part of in assisting in developing the trials for chronic depression and major depression.
You were telling me that. I find that very interesting. And I was wondering if, people that have Botox are happier than other people.
Well,
maybe
they might be. And there may be other reasons why they're happier.
They look better.
Well, and that was the common thinking years ago because we did all notice that the patients seemed to be happy.
So you're saying it can treat depression through injections
Yes.
into the face?
Right. So there's a dermatologist who is actually married to a psychiatrist in Texas. And many of us, just like the cosmetic use of Botox when we weren't using it for cosmetic, realized, like you had just mentioned, that the patients seemed to feel better after they had Botox. The assumption was, as you have assumed, that because they look better, they felt better about themselves. And you would think that would be a reasonable explanation to why they felt better. Interestingly, myself and several others noticed patients seem to know when they need to come back to get more Botox.
Yes, I didn't even think of that. But
And that is beyond looking in the mirror.
Oh, wow.
And so the hypothesis was something's going on at a central level in the brain that makes people want to come back for their Botox. It's time. And my patients come to me all the time. They go, I knew I was ready for the Botox. Well, what did you notice? Not sure, but I knew I was ready to get Botox
Right.
again.
Oh, I'm going to pay more attention
And,
next time.
and it's real, and
Wow.
it's midway through the clinical trials, and it will go through the FDA.
So it has to be approved by the FDA to be used for depression, is what you're saying?
No, in fact, what's interesting about Botox, for instance, so the frown lines is that everybody that you know probably gets treated, at least gets what we call glabellar frown lines. That was the first approval for Botox for cosmetic use. Interestingly, everywhere else for years was not FDA approved, whether you treated your crow's
They were
feet or your
just using
forehead,
it
but you
off-label?
use it what we call off-label.
Okay.
Exactly. You can treat, even before it was approved for migraine headaches. I had patients coming in, they had migraine headaches. They go, you know what, I'm coming here. Yeah, I'll look better, but my headaches are much better when you treat me with Botox. Now we're starting to see the same thing with what's called MDD, or major depressive disorder. So people can use it off-label until it's approved. But, there's certain stipulations and things you have to disclose to the patient when you're using a product off-label.
Well, what about pricing? If you're using it for depression, is the price any different than if you're using it for?
No,
Would it be?
I don't.
obese?
I don't charge for the whatever the disorder they're coming in for,
Right.
whether it's
That's what I was
cosmetic
just
or.
wondering if a
And I don't think.
psychiatrist is using it. Is
Well,
it the same?
Well, the only difference would be when it gets approved, that psychiatrists, just like neurologists who not treat migraine, will probably be able to get insurance coverage for it, unlike the cosmetic use, which is never covered.
Right.
So the pricing will
all-
change according to whatever the insurance carrier will pay.
Ah,
So that will change the game a little bit too.
right.
But it's a fascinating drug. Again, as I said, they try to demonize the drug. It's probably the wonder drug of our
The
lifetime.
only thing I've ever seen is sometimes people get like a droopy eyelid, but that's just because it's injected in the wrong place.
That's correct. It's not a problem with the drug. It's a problem with the
and I
injector.
know you correct that on people if they have that.
I do, and I wrote the first article talking about rescue therapies when people get a droopy lid after Botox, and some of the eye drops
How
work.
do you correct it?
Some eye drops work.
Eye drops?
There's adrenergic eye drops, and what that means is there's certain drugs that actually cause a contraction of one of the accessory muscles of the eyelid. So if you get a little bit of a droop, use the eye drops until the Botox effect goes away.
Really?
So and I wrote about it many years ago, and people still use those drops. Interestingly, the incidence of a droopy eyelid has gone down dramatically as doctors have gotten, and nurses or whoever injects have gotten more experienced.
because they know where.
They
not
just
to
know
inject.
where to areas
Okay.
to avoid. And the
What
other
are
thing,
the areas to avoid?
getting too close to the orbit or the rim of when you feel where the eyebrow is. If you get under there, that's where actually
Goes
the muscle
down
that
into-
lifts the lid and it gets under there. And there's other drugs other than Botox that are neurotoxins. So
Right.
that's the classification of drugs. You've all heard of Dysport and Xeomin.
And
they,
are they the same thing?
they're not exactly the same thing.
Because I've had
They-
people that get one of those and they say they prefer Botox, and I'm thinking it's the same chemical.
It's not exactly the
chemical
same. They work very similarly, but we know what we've learned, and I've always been challenged when something comes out new that when I speak at a meeting, they go, I want you to talk about the differences between Botox and Dysport or Botox and Xeomin. So I'll give a lecture on the differences between the two. And the same thing happens with fillers. Everybody assumes these fillers, because they're hyaluronic acid, are all the same. So you can make most of the neurotoxins, Botox, Dysport, Xeomin, work similarly. But you can't make them work exactly identically. But you can get the same results. You can eradicate lines, get rid of frown lines, forehead lines. But in my opinion, and I've written about this and I speak about it at the podium, you need to inject these drugs differently because their profiles are a little different. So you wouldn't inject them exactly the same way, and you need to understand the profiles of each of the drug to get your best result. So I can make any of them work, and some last longer than others. And I'm doing a new clinical trial with another new neurotoxin, which is going to be a very good neurotoxin. We just finished a clinical trial with a neurotoxin that's also a very good neurotoxin. So it's such a lucrative business. A lot of these pharmaceutical companies want to have one in their portfolio because they know they can make a lot of money. Mm-hmm. So it's there will be probably at the end of next year, there'll be 5 in the U.S. market.
Really?
Around the world, there's many more. But, our FDA, for many good reasons, is very tough on getting drugs approved. Mm-hmm. And for cosmetic, it's a high hurdle. And it's beyond the scope of talking about it today, but we have the highest hurdle probably anywhere in the world. And for a cosmetic dermatologic drug, it's higher than medicinal non-cosmetic medicine.
Why would that be?
They want to prove that it's absolutely effective without question. And we use what are called ordinate grading scales, where the grades are 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 usually. and you have to move for a drug to be approved. It can't just be one grade movement. It's got to be 2 grades of movement.
So anything new that comes out for our cosmetics is
it's
probably
a high hurdle.
effective.
Yes. There's no. So again, FDA looks at safety and efficacy on everything. Does it work, and is it safe? Are patients getting into trouble? And then what's interesting about a clinical trial is you learn how to inject it. People don't realize when new drugs go through a clinical trial, more often the doctor doesn't understand exactly how this one works versus the one they're familiar with. It's one of the reasons I do most of the FDA studies. I've done the FDA studies for all of them.
You
almost.
did clinical trials for Kybella, right?
I did.
Yeah. Okay.
So Kybella, as you know, is the now approved for submental fat. It's the drug that you inject to get rid of the double chin. If the double chin is mostly fat, the drug is incredibly effective. In fact, I was the only surgeon that went to the FDA. I was actually at the FDA panel that got it approved. But it's a very safe and effective drug. It works. High hurdle. It had an amazingly tough clinical trial, but they got what's called a 17-0 AdCom approval. That never happens. A unanimous approval of the drug. The trial was done so well.
It is very effective.
It's very effective, and they were so convinced that the drug was safe that it was immediately and unanimously approved.
Wow.
What's cool about Kybella is it's now going through clinical trials for other applications other than submental fat.
You were telling me that.
Whether love handles and what we call periaxillary fat, or sometimes called bra fat, reducing size of buttocks.
But I know it's very expensive just to do this area.
And
so if you're going to do all of this,
they're going to have to, in my opinion, and I know the executives at the company that own the drug, they will have to change the pricing structure to be competitive because a lot of surgeons
Nobody's
will go,
gonna
we'll
do
just do
that.
liposuction.
Right.
And I agree. What's interesting in a limited area like the submental fat is actually reasonable. So,
but if you get rid of that fat there, what about the skin?
well, that's the thing. I think you have to appropriately select your patients. Not everybody who has fat is necessarily a great candidate for Kybella. If you have good skin quality and a full neck, it's amazing. In young men who work out like crazy and they're really buff and they look great, but they can't get rid of their submental fat, weight reduction is not going to do it. And they have usually, young guy, pretty good skin quality. It's amazing.
Oh,
Even for,
okay.
young to middle-aged women who they're really not lax much, but they've always had that double chin, and they've hated it since they're in high
Right.
school. It's incredibly effective.
Well, tell us about your practice. You're on Glades Road.
Glades Road, across from FAU at the Boca Raton Regional Hospital, Building 660 Glades.
Very conveniently located.
It's a good place, great parking
right
garage.
on
I
Glades
parked there.
Road, right near I-95, right near the hospital.
Right near the hospital.
And there were so many things I didn't get to with you today. So
Next show.
Yes, can I have you back?
Of course.
Okay.
Becky,
Thank
thanks.
you. Thank you very,
Appreciate
very
it.
much. And I'm going to try to get through your CV at some point.
Okay. Thanks so much.
Thank you.